9:17 in the morning on March 7, 1945. Captain Karl Friesenhahn stood at the western end of the Ludendorff Bridge near Remagen, Germany, staring at the detonator in his hands and knowing that everything in his life had come down to this single moment. American tanks were visible on the hills west of town, maybe 3 kilometers away and closing fast, their commanders probably already radioing back that they had spotted an intact bridge across the Rhine. Friesenhahn had tried twice already to destroy this bridge, and both attempts had failed in ways that seemed almost designed by fate to mock him. The first attempt produced nothing except a mechanical click when he pressed the plunger. The electrical detonation system completely dead, for reasons he still did not understand. The second attempt, using backup fuses, created massive explosions that damaged several bridge supports and blew holes in the roadway. But when the smoke cleared, the fundamental structure remained intact, the massive steel arches still spanning the Rhine as stubbornly as before. Now Friesenhahn had one explosive charge remaining, one final opportunity to complete his mission before American forces seized the last intact bridge into Germany and rendered weeks of German defensive planning completely worthless. His hand trembled slightly as he positioned his finger on the detonator plunger, not from fear, but from exhaustion after 3 days of almost no sleep while preparing demolitions and dealing with the chaos of German forces retreating across the bridge in a constant stream. The orders from higher command had been absolutely clear and repeated multiple times with increasing urgency: destroy the bridge before the Americans reach it, use whatever means necessary, accept no excuses for failure. But those orders had not accounted for sabotaged equipment, inadequate explosives, structural resilience beyond engineering calculations, or simple bad luck at the worst possible moment. Friesenhahn pressed the detonator at exactly 9:17 a.m., and this time the charges detonated properly with a roar that echoed across the entire valley and created shockwaves powerful enough to shatter windows in Remagen several hundred meters away. Massive clouds of smoke and debris erupted from multiple points along the bridge structure, and for several seconds the entire span disappeared behind a wall of black smoke that rose hundreds of meters into the morning sky. Every German soldier, watching from the eastern bank, thought the bridge must surely collapse after such a tremendous explosion, and even Friesenhahn allowed himself a moment of hope that he had finally succeeded in his mission. But as the smoke began to clear and visibility improved, the impossible became apparent once again because the Ludendorff Bridge still stood. The explosions had caused significant damage, weakening critical support structures and creating large holes in the roadway deck, but the massive steel arches that formed the bridge's fundamental framework remained intact and continued to span the Rhine with the same stubborn determination they had shown for nearly 30 years. Friesenhahn stared in complete disbelief at his third consecutive failure, knowing with absolute certainty that he would be held personally responsible for what German command would view as incompetence or possibly even deliberate sabotage. He had no more explosives, no more detonation systems, and no more options except to flee across the bridge himself before American forces arrived and captured him along with the structure he had failed to destroy. How did one bridge become so critically important that its capture would help determine the outcome of World War II in Europe? How did German military engineers trained in demolition procedures manage to fail 3 separate times at destroying a structure they themselves had helped build and should have understood completely? And what happened during the chaotic 24 hours after American forces first spotted the intact bridge that would change the strategic situation so dramatically that historians would later mark it as one of the war's genuine turning points? This is the story of the bridge at Remagen, the structure that 3 demolition attempts could not destroy, and how technical failures combined with split-second battlefield decisions to create one of history's most consequential accidents. The Ludendorff Bridge had been constructed during World War I between 1916 and 1918. Built specifically as a strategic railway bridge to move German troops and military supplies to the Western Front more efficiently during that earlier conflict. German military engineers had designed it with typical thoroughness, using massive amounts of steel and reinforced concrete to create a structure capable of bearing enormous weights while also being defensible against potential enemy attacks. The bridge stretched 325 meters across the Rhine River at one of its narrower crossing points near the small town of Remagen, featuring 3 large steel arches supported by stone towers that gave the structure an imposing, almost fortress-like appearance. Two sets of railway tracks ran down the center of the bridge deck, while wooden planking on either side could accommodate vehicle traffic or troops on foot, making it remarkably versatile for various military logistics purposes. By early March of 1945, the strategic situation in Western Germany had deteriorated catastrophically from the German perspective, with American and British forces having smashed through the Siegfried Line defensive fortifications and now racing eastward toward the Rhine River at speeds that shocked commanders on both sides. The original Allied plan had called for a carefully coordinated assault crossing of the Rhine scheduled for late March, allowing time for engineers to prepare extensive bridging equipment and for forces to build up sufficient strength for the operation. But the unexpectedly rapid German collapse was creating opportunities that Allied commanders had not anticipated, and suddenly plans were being improvised and adapted on a daily basis as new possibilities presented themselves. General Dwight Eisenhower's strategy involved multiple simultaneous Rhine crossings at different points to prevent Germans from concentrating their defensive forces, with British Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group scheduled to make the main effort in the north near Wesel, while American forces would conduct supporting crossings further south. Every bridge across the Rhine was considered critically important for both sides, and German demolition teams had received absolutely clear orders to destroy every single crossing without exception once Allied forces came within striking distance. By early March, every bridge for hundreds of kilometers had been systematically demolished according to plan, creating what German commanders hoped would be an impenetrable natural barrier that would buy precious time to organize a coherent final defense. The American forces approaching Remagen in early March belonged to the 9th Armored Division commanded by Brigadier General William Hoger, and they had no particular reason to expect anything unusual as they pushed eastward through the Eifel region toward the Rhine. Hoger's division had been fighting continuously for weeks and was exhausted but still combat effective, operating under orders to advance to the river and secure whatever positions they could on the western bank, while waiting for the planned assault crossing to begin later in the month. Nobody expected to find an intact bridge, because intelligence reports consistently confirmed that German forces were systematically destroying every crossing, and standard military doctrine assumed that any bridge not already demolished would be blown up the instant Allied troops came within visual range. On the morning of March 7th, a task force from Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division under Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman was advancing through hills west of Remagen, when forward observers radioed back with a report that seemed almost too incredible to believe. They could see what appeared to be an intact bridge still standing across the Rhine, though they cautioned that it might be a trap or that German forces might be preparing to demolish it at any moment. Engerman immediately ordered his forces forward at maximum speed to investigate while simultaneously reporting the sighting up the chain of command. Recognizing that if the report proved accurate, this represented an opportunity of potentially incalculable strategic value that might not exist 5 minutes from now. As American tanks and infantry carriers raced down the steep hillside roads toward Remagen, the soldiers could hardly believe what their eyes were showing them, because there in the valley below stood the Ludendorff Bridge, completely intact and apparently undamaged, spanning the Rhine River. This seemed impossible, given that every other bridge for hundreds of kilometers in both directions had been destroyed days or weeks earlier, and the natural assumption was that German forces must be preparing elaborate demolitions that would detonate the moment American troops got too close. Tank commanders ordered their crews to button up hatches and prepare for potential ambush, while infantry dismounted and began advancing cautiously through the town's outskirts, expecting either heavy resistance or a massive explosion at literally any second. Back on the bridge, Captain Friesenhahn was dealing with a cascading series of problems that seemed almost deliberately designed by malicious fate to prevent him from completing his mission, regardless of how hard he tried or how much effort he invested. The first fundamental problem was that he simply did not have enough explosives available for the task, because earlier in the war, someone in the German command structure had decided that Remagen Bridge was not a demolition priority and had allocated minimal resources for its potential destruction. This meant that even if Friesenhahn placed his limited charges perfectly and every single one detonated exactly as designed, the explosions still might not generate sufficient destructive force to collapse the massive structure, merely damaging it without achieving the complete annihilation that his orders demanded. The second major problem was that retreating German forces, including both military units and civilian refugees, had been streaming across the bridge for several days, carrying wounded soldiers and fleeing families, making it politically and morally impossible to destroy the structure until the absolute last possible moment, even though pure military necessity dictated blowing it much earlier. German officers on the eastern bank had been arguing about the exact timing for days, with some insisting the bridge should be demolished immediately, while others demanded it remain open for just a few more hours to allow additional units to escape. The third critical problem was that the electrical detonation system had been sabotaged or accidentally damaged at some unknown point by persons unknown, possibly by local civilians who did not want their historic bridge destroyed, or possibly by retreating soldiers who wanted to ensure their own escape route remained open as long as possible. Friesenhahn had discovered this sabotage problem only when his first detonation attempt at approximately 8:40 a.m. produced absolutely nothing except that mocking click, at which point he was forced to frantically improvise using backup detonation systems that had never been designed or tested for this specific application and proved woefully inadequate for the task. The fourth problem, compounding everything else, was complete communication breakdown with higher command due to damaged telephone lines and overwhelmed radio networks, meaning that Friesenhahn was essentially making life or death decisions in isolation, without clear guidance or support from the officers who were supposed to be coordinating the bridge's defense and destruction as part of a larger strategic plan. As American forces entered Remagen proper, they encountered only scattered resistance from a hastily assembled collection of German soldiers who seemed far more interested in escaping across the bridge than in defending the town. And within minutes, the Americans had fought their way through to reach the bridge's western approach. Lieutenant Karl Friesenhahn of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, was the first American officer to reach a position where he could clearly observe the entire bridge structure, and he immediately radioed back to his commanders with the stunning confirmation that the bridge appeared completely intact, though he could see what looked like German engineers working frantically around the support towers, doing something that was probably related to last-minute demolition preparations. The decision about whether to attempt an immediate assault across the bridge or wait for reinforcements and better intelligence fell to several officers in rapid succession as reports filtered up the chain of command with increasing urgency and disbelief. Company and battalion commanders had to make split-second tactical decisions about committing their forces to what might very well be an elaborate death trap, while higher-level commanders had to consider the enormous strategic implications of either successfully seizing or catastrophically losing this unexpected opportunity. Standing orders for all Allied units were absolutely clear that bridge seizures were maximum priority whenever possible. But those orders had been written assuming any captured bridges would need to be immediately secured against German counterattacks, not that they would need to be rushed in desperate haste before Germans could destroy them in the final seconds before capture. Captain Friesenhahn made his decision to attempt the third and final demolition at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after receiving increasingly frantic and threatening radio messages from his superiors demanding to know why the bridge was still standing and ordering him to destroy it immediately, regardless of who might still be crossing it at that exact moment. He pressed the detonator plunger for the third time with fingers that trembled from stress and exhaustion rather than fear, and this time the charges actually detonated as designed with massive explosions that sent smoke and debris flying hundreds of meters into the air and created shock waves powerful enough to be felt throughout the entire valley. For one brief moment, everyone watching from both sides thought the bridge must surely collapse after such powerful explosions. But as the smoke gradually cleared, the impossible truth became apparent once again, because the Ludendorff Bridge still stood. The third set of explosions had damaged the bridge significantly beyond what the previous attempts had achieved, weakening several critical support structures and creating large dangerous holes in the roadway deck. But the fundamental structural integrity of those massive steel arches remained intact, and the bridge continued to span the Rhine River as stubbornly and impossibly as before. Friesenhahn stared in absolute disbelief and mounting horror at his third consecutive failure, knowing with complete certainty that he would be held personally responsible for what German military courts would almost certainly view as criminal incompetence or deliberate treason, potentially facing immediate execution for failing to complete his assigned mission despite having 3 separate opportunities. He had no more explosives remaining, no more detonation systems available, and absolutely no more options whatsoever, except to abandon his position and flee across the bridge himself before American forces seized it and captured him, along with the structure he had catastrophically failed to destroy. Lieutenant Timmerman watched the third explosion from his position on Remagen's western edge, and when the smoke cleared enough to confirm that the bridge was still standing, despite obvious damage, he made what would prove to be one of the single most consequential tactical decisions of the entire European war, by immediately ordering his infantry company to assault across the bridge without waiting for additional orders from higher headquarters or for tank support or for any of the other elements that standard doctrine would normally require before attempting such a dangerous operation. This was an incredibly risky decision because Timmerman had absolutely no way of knowing whether German forces had additional demolition charges in place ready to detonate, whether the obviously damaged bridge structure would actually support the weight of troops crossing it, or whether German defenders on the eastern bank were prepared to massacre his men with overwhelming defensive fire the moment they stepped onto the bridge deck. But Timmerman was an experienced combat officer who recognized that this was an absolutely fleeting opportunity that might literally not exist 60 seconds from now, and that any hesitation whatsoever would give German engineers time to either properly destroy the bridge or organize a defense that would make crossing it prohibitively expensive in American casualties. He gave the order to move at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon and led his men forward onto the Ludendorff Bridge, advancing cautiously at first because nobody knew if the damaged structure would collapse beneath them. Then, with increasing speed and confidence, as they realized the Germans were not mounting any serious coordinated defense, and the bridge seemed stable enough despite the visible damage. German machine gun fire from the eastern bank and from defensive positions in the bridge towers created some casualties among the advancing Americans, but nothing approaching the devastating defensive fire that a properly organized defense would have produced. And within just minutes, Timmerman's infantry had fought their way across the entire 325-meter span, and were establishing a small precarious bridgehead on the eastern side of the Rhine River. Additional American units poured across the bridge as soon as word spread through radio networks that it was passable and relatively safe, with combat engineers racing forward to assess structural integrity and begin clearing debris from the roadway, while infantry and armor units streamed across in an ever-increasing flow to expand and defend the bridgehead against the German counterattacks that everyone knew would be coming soon. The news that American forces had successfully captured an intact bridge across the Rhine spread through Allied command structures with the speed and emotional impact of an earthquake, completely transforming the strategic situation in Western Germany within just hours and rendering weeks of careful planning essentially obsolete. General Omar Bradley first learned about the bridge capture at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, when a staff officer burst into his headquarters with the almost unbelievable report, and Bradley immediately grasped the enormous significance and issued orders giving maximum priority to exploiting this breakthrough, regardless of what disruption it might cause to other planned operations. He telephoned Supreme Commander Eisenhower directly to inform him of the development, and Eisenhower reportedly responded with rare enthusiastic emotion about this unexpected strategic gift that could potentially save thousands of Allied casualties and weeks of bloody fighting. Within German command structures, the news created reactions ranging from panic to fury, to desperate attempts at damage control as officers at every level recognized the catastrophic implications of this failure and scrambled to formulate responses. Adolf Hitler, upon learning that American forces had crossed the Rhine River weeks ahead of the carefully planned Allied timetable, reportedly flew into one of his increasingly common rages and demanded immediate answers about who was responsible for this disaster and why the bridge had not been destroyed as explicitly ordered. The Führer immediately issued orders that every available German unit in the region, regardless of its current assignment or condition, should be committed to destroying the American bridgehead and recapturing or at absolute minimum destroying the bridge, and he also demanded that the officers responsible for the bridge's defense and demolition be arrested immediately and court-martialed for what he considered obvious dereliction of duty. This vengeful reaction eventually led to the execution of 5 German officers, including Major Hans Scheller, who had overall responsibility for Remagen sector defenses, even though he had not actually been present at the bridge when it was captured and had no direct involvement in the failed demolition attempts. Over the following 10 days, American forces poured across the Ludendorff Bridge and through several hastily constructed pontoon bridges that engineers built alongside it, systematically building up the eastern bridgehead to a strength of 8 full divisions, totaling over 70,000 men with appropriate tank, artillery, and logistical support. The bridge itself continued to carry enormous volumes of traffic despite its damaged condition, with engineers working literally around the clock to reinforce weakened sections and repair the roadway, while traffic controllers managed a constant stream of vehicles crossing in both directions. German forces made desperate and increasingly futile attempts to destroy the bridge using every weapon and tactic available, including sustained artillery bombardment from distant positions, Luftwaffe bombing raids conducted by some of Germany's last remaining operational aircraft, including experimental jets, naval mines and explosive devices, floated downriver on the Rhine current, and even highly inaccurate V-2 rockets fired from launch sites in Holland. Every single attack either missed the bridge entirely or caused only minor additional damage without achieving the complete catastrophic destruction that German commanders so desperately needed, and the American bridgehead continued to grow stronger with each passing hour. The structural damage from the original German demolition attempts, combined with 10 days of carrying loads far exceeding anything the bridge designers had ever envisioned, finally proved too much on March 17th at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the Ludendorff Bridge suddenly collapsed without significant warning, sending a section of roadway and several vehicles plunging into the Rhine River below. 28 American engineers who were working on bridge repairs at that exact moment were killed in the collapse, and another 63 were injured, making it one of the deadliest single incidents for American forces during the entire Remagen operation. But by this point, the bridge had already accomplished its crucial strategic purpose, because American engineers had constructed multiple pontoon bridges alongside the ruins, and the bridgehead on the eastern bank had grown so powerful that German forces had absolutely no realistic hope of eliminating it through any military means available to them. The capture and 10-day operational use of the Remagen Bridge fundamentally changed the strategic situation across Western Germany and contributed significantly to shortening the European war by several weeks according to detailed post-war military analysis. Instead of waiting until late March or early April for the massive, carefully planned Rhine crossings that Allied commanders had been meticulously preparing for months, American forces were able to establish a major bridgehead in early March that immediately tied down significant German reserves and prevented them from effectively defending against the subsequent crossings that occurred elsewhere along the river. German forces were compelled to commit units originally intended for other defensive sectors to futile attempts at eliminating the Remagen bridgehead, which weakened their overall defensive posture and made the later British and American crossings far easier and less costly than they would otherwise have been. General Eisenhower wrote in his post-war memoirs that the bridge at Remagen was worth its weight in gold and represented one of those rare fortunate accidents that occasionally changes the entire course of military campaigns in ways that no amount of brilliant planning or massive resources can achieve. The soldiers who participated in the initial capture and the engineers who maintained the damaged structure for 10 days under constant German attack received numerous decorations recognizing their courage and quick thinking, with Lieutenant Timmerman, who led that first desperate assault across the bridge, being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. Tragically, Timmerman died from wounds received in subsequent fighting in April 1945 and never lived to see how famous and historically significant his March 7th decision would become. Captain Friesenhahn, who had failed 3 times to destroy the bridge, managed to escape capture during the chaos and survived the war's final weeks, though he spent the rest of his life haunted by the memory of that failure and by the knowledge that 5 brother officers had been executed for what was fundamentally a failure of equipment and circumstances rather than of personal will or effort. Detailed post-war investigations concluded that the demolition failures resulted from a complex combination of factors including inadequate explosive quantities, sabotaged or damaged detonation equipment, structural resilience that exceeded German engineering calculations, and simple catastrophically bad luck in the placement and timing of the charges that did detonate. The bridge had been designed and built too well and had proven far stronger than anyone anticipated, while the chaos of retreat and systematic communication breakdowns had prevented anyone from recognizing and correcting these problems before American forces arrived. The small town of Remagen became permanently associated with this pivotal moment in military history, with the bridge towers that survived the eventual collapse being converted decades later into a museum dedicated to peace and reconciliation. The museum tells the comprehensive story of the bridge's construction during World War I, its dramatic capture in World War II, and its ultimate destruction, serving as a permanent reminder of how individual moments and personal decisions can shape the outcomes of vast historical conflicts. Veterans from both American and German sides occasionally returned to Remagen in subsequent decades to reflect on those chaotic days in March 1945 when the fate of a single bridge held such enormous importance for the war's outcome. The strategic and tactical lessons of Remagen regarding the critical importance of seizing unexpected opportunities and the catastrophic consequences of failed demolitions became standard case studies in military academies around the world, illustrating fundamental principles about how commanders at every level must be prepared to deviate rapidly from established plans and take calculated risks when battlefield circumstances suddenly change in unexpected ways. The tactical lessons specifically about bridge demolition and defense led to significant changes in how modern militaries approach these critical tasks, with far more redundant systems and multiple fail-safes built into any demolition plan to prevent the kind of cascading failures that occurred at Remagen. Perhaps the most important lesson was simply that in warfare, as in life, some of the most crucial and consequential moments come not from brilliant planning or overwhelming strength, but rather from being mentally and physically prepared to act decisively and courageously when unexpected opportunities present themselves without warning. The Ludendorff Bridge stood under American control for just 10 days before structural failure caused its collapse, but those 10 days proved more strategically valuable than months of conventional fighting might have achieved, demonstrating once again that in warfare timing and luck can matter just as much as strength and skill. The bridge that Hitler could not destroy, despite 3 attempts and overwhelming strategic motivation, became the bridge that helped destroy the Third Reich by opening an unexpected gateway into the heart of Germany weeks before Allied planners had thought it would be possible. And all of this happened because of faulty electrical wiring, inadequate explosive charges, and one young American lieutenant who made the split-second decision to run across a damaged bridge rather than wait for explicit orders from higher headquarters. The first hours after capturing the bridge were absolutely frantic, as American commanders at every level suddenly realized they had been handed an unexpected strategic gift that needed maximum exploitation before German forces could organize an effective response. General Bradley issued orders giving absolute priority to getting forces across the Rhine at Remagen, regardless of what disruption this might cause to other carefully planned operations, and within just hours, entire units originally assigned to completely different sectors were being redirected toward this single bridge to maximize the exploitation of this breakthrough opportunity. Traffic control immediately became a nightmare as vehicles of every description tried to funnel onto the single damaged roadway, creating massive traffic jams that backed up for several kilometers on the western approach, while officers shouted contradictory orders and military police struggled desperately to impose some semblance of organization on the chaos. Combat engineers became the unsung heroes of those first critical hours because they had to simultaneously assess whether the obviously damaged bridge could support the enormous weights being placed on it, while also conducting emergency repairs on the worst damage and installing temporary safety measures, all while working under intermittent German artillery fire from positions on the eastern bank. The bridge had been significantly weakened by those 3 German demolition attempts, with several important support beams either cracked or partially severed, and large sections of the roadway deck damaged or completely destroyed, creating dangerous gaps that had to be quickly spanned with temporary wooden planking before vehicles could safely cross. Engineers worked in continuous shifts around the clock, using whatever materials they could scavenge, including timber stripped from destroyed buildings in Remagen and steel plates cut from knocked-out German vehicles abandoned nearby. The German response to losing the Remagen Bridge developed gradually in stages over the first hours and days, as commanders at different organizational levels received the shocking news and attempted to formulate appropriate responses with whatever limited resources remained available to them. Local commanders in the immediate Remagen area had almost nothing useful to work with because most German units had been completely shattered by the rapid American advance and were scattered across the countryside, trying desperately to escape encirclement, which meant the initial German counterattacks consisted of little more than uncoordinated artillery fire from whatever batteries happened to be within range, and small groups of disorganized infantry who launched sporadic probing attacks that accomplished nothing except getting themselves killed or captured. As word spread up through the German chain of command, the scale and intensity of response gradually increased, with orders issued to commit whatever forces could be scraped together from any source regardless of their original assignments or current operational condition. Adolf Hitler's personal involvement in directing the German response to Remagen ensured that the battle would receive maximum priority from the German High Command, even though this made very little strategic sense, given the overall catastrophic military situation. The Führer became absolutely obsessed with recapturing or destroying the bridge and eliminating the American bridgehead, treating it as a personal affront that demanded immediate retribution regardless of the costs involved, and he issued a constant stream of increasingly unrealistic orders demanding that every available resource be committed to this single objective. German divisions that should have been defending other critical sectors were pulled out of their positions and sent toward Remagen in piecemeal fashion. Luftwaffe units were ordered to launch strikes despite Allied air superiority, making such attacks nearly suicidal for the pilots involved, and even experimental weapons, including the V-2 ballistic missile, were redirected to target this single tactical objective, even though using such inaccurate strategic weapons against small tactical targets made absolutely no military sense whatsoever. The Luftwaffe attacks on Remagen Bridge began on March 8, just 24 hours after its capture, and continued intermittently for the next 9 days, until the bridge finally collapsed, representing some of the most desperate and costly air operations that the rapidly diminishing German Air Force attempted during the final months of the war. German pilots flying a mixture of obsolete conventional aircraft and a handful of the revolutionary new Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters made repeated courageous attempts to destroy the bridge with aerial bombs, despite knowing that overwhelming Allied fighter cover made survival extremely unlikely, and that accurately hitting such a relatively small target from bombing altitude while under constant attack was nearly impossible. Some particularly brave or desperate pilots made incredibly low-level attack runs directly at the bridge structure, trying to score direct hits with bombs, or even attempting to crash their damaged burning aircraft into the structure in kamikaze-style suicide attacks. But the absolutely concentrated American anti-aircraft fire around Remagen created a nearly impenetrable defensive screen of steel and explosives that shot down dozens of German aircraft without achieving a single successful direct bomb hit on the bridge itself. American anti-aircraft defenses established around the Remagen bridgehead became the single most concentrated in the entire European theatre during those 10 critical days, with over 600 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of defensive fire that could engage attacking aircraft from virtually any direction or altitude. The guns ranged from heavy 90mm pieces capable of reaching high-altitude bombers down to quad-mounted 50-caliber machine guns that created literal walls of tracer fire against low-flying targets, and the crews maintained constant vigilance, knowing that their accurate fire might be all that prevented a successful German air attack from destroying this absolutely vital Rhine crossing. The concentration of defensive fire was so incredibly intense that German pilots who survived missions to Remagen reported it felt like flying directly into a solid, impenetrable wall of steel, and many pilots actually refused subsequent missions to the target after witnessing what happened to their comrades who attempted to press attacks through that devastating defensive barrage. German artillery bombardment of the bridge and surrounding bridgehead area was somewhat more successful at causing American casualties and general disruption though it never came close to achieving the primary goal of actually destroying the bridge structure itself, with German gunners firing literally thousands of shells over the 10-day period from carefully concealed positions on the heights east of the Rhine that offered good observation of the American-held western bank and bridge approaches. The Germans had to constantly move their artillery pieces to avoid devastating American counter-battery fire directed by spotter aircraft and forward observers. But this necessary mobility meant they could never mass truly sufficient firepower in any single location to achieve genuinely devastating concentrated effects against point targets. Most German artillery shells fell relatively harmlessly into the Rhine River itself or into empty areas around the bridge rather than scoring the kind of direct hits on the structure or on concentrated groups of American troops and vehicles that might have made a real difference. Total American casualties from all German artillery fire around Remagen during the 10-day period amounted to several hundred soldiers killed and wounded, which was certainly significant and tragic, but remained far less than the many thousands who certainly would have died attempting a conventional opposed assault river crossing against prepared German defensive positions. Perhaps the single most bizarre German attempt to destroy the Remagen Bridge involved the highly experimental use of V-2 ballistic rockets against a tactical battlefield target, representing one of the very few times during the entire war that these cutting-edge weapons were employed against anything except large cities and major strategic targets. On March 17th, just a few hours before the bridge finally collapsed from accumulated structural failure, a V-2 rocket was launched from a site somewhere in Holland, aimed generally at the Remagen Bridge coordinates, though whether it was deliberately and accurately targeted at the bridge or simply happened to be aimed in that general direction remains unclear from surviving German records. The rocket fell approximately 300 meters short of the bridge and detonated harmlessly in the Rhine River, creating a spectacular fountain of water and spray, but causing absolutely no damage whatsoever to any important targets, clearly demonstrating the complete futility of attempting to use such wildly inaccurate weapons against small, precise tactical targets, regardless of whatever psychological impact value they might theoretically possess. Perhaps the most creative German attempt to destroy the bridge involved sending various types of naval mines and improvised explosive devices floating down the Rhine current during darkness, hoping they would strike the bridge support pillars and detonate with sufficient force to cause catastrophic structural damage. German engineers working under extremely difficult conditions assembled various types of floating mines, including some equipped with magnetic detonators that were theoretically supposed to attach themselves automatically to steel bridge supports, and others that were simply timed explosive charges encased in waterproof containers, and these deadly devices were released far upriver during hours of darkness to drift silently down toward Remagen with the current. American engineers quickly countered this particular threat by stretching heavy steel nets and cables across the river channel upstream of the bridge, specifically designed to catch floating mines before they could reach their intended target, and small teams of brave engineers in boats patrolled constantly throughout the nights to intercept and carefully disable any mines that somehow evaded the protective nets. Some German mines did occasionally manage to get through the defensive systems and detonate either against or very near the bridge supports, but none of these explosions caused any truly significant structural damage beyond adding slightly to the accumulated stress and fatigue that the already weakened structure was enduring from the absolutely enormous traffic loads it was carrying 24 hours every single day. Engineering work on and around the Remagen Bridge during those 10 incredibly intense days represented one of the most impressive and underappreciated technical achievements of the entire European war, given the extremely difficult and dangerous circumstances under which all this critical work had to be performed. Combat engineers had to somehow keep the badly damaged bridge operational and safe for continuous heavy traffic while simultaneously conducting emergency repairs on the most critical damage, installing sophisticated safety monitoring systems to detect dangerous structural movement or imminent failure, carefully locating and removing unexploded German demolition charges that were still in place from the original failed attempts, and beginning construction of multiple pontoon bridges to provide essential backup crossings in case the main structure suddenly failed without warning. All of this critically important technical work occurred under more or less constant German artillery fire, and the ever-present terrifying threat that the bridge might collapse catastrophically without any warning whatsoever, which required engineers to take calculated risks that in peacetime conditions would have been considered absolutely unacceptable but were deemed necessary given the enormous strategic importance of maintaining this unexpected Rhine crossing. Construction of military pontoon bridges alongside the damaged Ludendorff Bridge began within just 48 hours of the initial capture and proceeded with remarkable speed, despite genuinely difficult conditions, including swift dangerous current, floating debris in the water, and periodic German artillery fire that occasionally scored direct hits on construction crews, causing casualties. American combat engineers had become highly skilled at rapid pontoon bridge construction through many months of intensive practice crossing smaller rivers across France and Germany during the advance, and they applied all this hard-won experience to the Rhine crossing operation, with truly impressive results that saw the first complete pontoon bridge finished and actively carrying military traffic within just 3 days of starting construction. Additional pontoon bridges followed in rapid succession over the next several days until the Americans had successfully established multiple independent crossing points that collectively could handle far more total traffic volume than the single damaged railway bridge ever could, which meant that even when the Ludendorff Bridge inevitably collapsed under the accumulated stress, American military operations could and did continue across the Rhine without any significant interruption or delay. Life for American soldiers holding defensive positions in the Remagen bridgehead during those 10 intense days was a strange and unsettling mixture of genuine exhilaration at their historic achievement, combined with very real fear that massive German counterattacks might somehow manage to push them back across the Rhine, or that the bridge might suddenly collapse behind them, leaving their forces isolated and completely surrounded deep in enemy territory. The bridgehead perimeter was relatively small, initially measuring just a few kilometers deep from the Rhine riverbank, which meant that German artillery positioned on the surrounding heights could reach virtually any position within the American-held area, and soldiers had to dig proper defensive fighting positions while simultaneously preparing for potential German counterattacks that might come from literally any direction. The Germans never actually managed to mount a properly coordinated major counterattack with sufficient force to seriously threaten the growing bridgehead, partly because they genuinely lacked the necessary resources to organize such an operation, and partly because American reinforcements were arriving and deploying faster than German units could possibly be assembled and committed to battle. But the theoretical threat remained very real in everyone's minds, and soldiers maintained high alert status throughout the entire 10-day period, expecting attacks that fortunately never fully materialized. American commanders operating within the bridgehead faced difficult decisions about how to balance aggressive expansion operations to secure more defensible positions and wider perimeters against the serious risk of dangerously overextending their forces before adequate combat support and logistics could be brought across the limited available crossing points to sustain expanded operations. Different unit commanders naturally approached this fundamental balance differently based on their individual assessments of German capabilities and likely intentions, with some units pushing forward quite aggressively to seize commanding terrain features and significantly widen the overall bridgehead perimeter, while other units focused primarily on carefully consolidating existing defensive positions and ensuring that supply lines could adequately support any future expanded operations. The lack of completely clear unified direction from higher headquarters during the initial chaotic period created some temporary confusion about overall strategic objectives and tactical priorities. But by the third full day after the bridge capture, this confusion had been largely resolved through establishment of clear command relationships and assignment of specific geographic sectors and missions to different divisions operating in the bridgehead. As the Ludendorff Bridge entered its final days of operational service, the accumulated damage from the original German demolition attempts, combined with 10 days of constant heavy traffic, carrying loads far exceeding anything the original bridge designers had ever envisioned, ongoing German artillery and air attacks adding incremental damage, and simple structural metal fatigue from the enormous stress of supporting such massive concentrated loads all combined together to create an increasingly dangerous situation where catastrophic collapse was becoming more inevitable with each passing hour. American engineers monitoring the bridge's structural condition noted genuinely alarming increases in measured structural movement and stress levels that clearly indicated critical support members were progressively failing. But the overwhelming military necessity of maintaining this crucial crossing meant that traffic volume could not be significantly reduced, even as the danger of imminent collapse continued to increase hour by hour. By March 15th, engineers were making strong recommendations that only absolutely essential military traffic should continue using the potentially unstable Ludendorff Bridge, and that all routine crossings should be redirected to use the newly completed pontoon bridges instead. But the sheer volume of traffic trying to cross the Rhine in both directions was so enormous that these prudent safety recommendations were only partially implemented in actual practice. On the afternoon of March 17th, at approximately 3 o'clock local time, sudden catastrophic structural failure occurred in one of the main arch support members that had been progressively weakened by the original German demolition charges and then further stressed far beyond its design limits by 10 continuous days of intensive use, carrying loads that vastly exceeded anything the bridge designers had ever anticipated. The failure of this single critical structural member created an immediate progressive collapse sequence as the enormous load it had been supporting was suddenly transferred to adjacent support members, which were themselves already weakened and damaged, and simply could not handle the massive additional stress being placed on them. Within just seconds, a devastating chain reaction of cascading structural failures resulted in a major section of the bridge roadway approximately 40 meters long suddenly dropping into the Rhine River far below, taking with it several military vehicles and the group of engineers who happened to be working on reinforcement of that particular section at that exact tragic moment. The collapse occurred without any significant advance warning that would have allowed evacuation of personnel from the danger zone, though some engineers later reported hearing unusual cracking and groaning sounds in the steel structure during the minutes immediately before the final failure, and the terrifying speed of the progressive collapse meant that people actually on the affected section literally had no chance whatsoever to escape before being carried down into the cold water. Rescue operations began immediately, with boats launched from both riverbanks to search desperately for survivors in the frigid water, while other engineers carefully checked whether the remaining sections of bridge structure were stable or in immediate danger of further progressive collapse. And within approximately 1 hour, military authorities determined that the entire remaining bridge structure was far too unstable and dangerous to use for any purpose and should be completely evacuated immediately. The final death toll from the sudden collapse was 28 American combat engineers killed and another 63 injured in various ways, making it one of the single deadliest incidents for American forces during the entire Remagen operation, though this tragic number remained far smaller than the many thousands of soldiers who almost certainly would have died in a conventional opposed river-crossing assault without the unexpected gift of an intact bridge.